Welcome to Nature Network.
Our special guest today is Mr. John Hewlett from Murray State University in Kentucky. And today we're going to be talking about the hidden realm of America's most iconic snake, the timber rattlesnake.
Your favorite.
It is indeed my favorite. So don't forget to like us, subscribe, and share, because sharing is truly your nature link. And our guest today is Mr. John Hewlett from Murray University. John, we're going to talk about timber rattlesnakes, and I'm definitely glad you joined us because timber rattlesnakes are definitely one of my favorite animals. You know, in the animal world, people say, you know, what's your favorite animal? And I say it's like asking who's your favorite kid. But hey, timber rattlesnakes, they're still my favorite. So I'm glad you joined us today, and let's just jump right into it. I mean, to me, this is a fascinating animal with a super wide range. I mean, so it's been a very successful in the whole lineage of rattlesnakes, which is, for as sensitive as it is, it is really, you know, from New York down to Florida on over into Texas and Oklahoma, just a wide-ranging snake that was allowed to spread out back in the days when we actually had trees everywhere, when a squirrel could travel from New York to the Mississippi River without ever touching the ground. And we just, you know, with fragmentation, we just don't have that anymore. So that's something that I know has put pressure on the timber rattlesnakes, and that's why we're looking at those. So tell me some about your work. You're working out of Kentucky with these guys.
I am. So I'm finishing up my graduate work at Murray State, and I've kind of had a long association with the university here. It's my hometown, and I started working on campus when I was in high school, and I got my undergraduate degree here, where I studied biology and chemistry. And as a kid, growing up in the 80s and the 90s, I was a kid of the space shuttle program. And so I lack all athletic ability and musical talent. So you don't want me on your sports team. But I had an interest in biology and aerospace. And so my hobby as a kid was flying airplanes. And so when I graduated with my undergraduate degree, there wasn't a lot of hiring for biologists with a bachelor's degree. And so I was a commercial pilot for a little over a decade.
Oh, wow.
And had two kids that I like to spend time with. And I got tired of hotel appreciation time and decided I was going to go back to graduate school. And I got on an NSF grant, and they had hired a new professor who was, like an ambush predator. I had kind of hung out around her lab as they, 2 weeks after they'd hired her. And then I had kind of this idea in my head, and I went in there and kind of proposed it, and she was gracious enough to take it. So I come from a medical family. And one thing that I'm interested in is I come from a medical family, but I'm somebody who likes to spend time outside. So one thing I have an interest in is combining biomedical research approaches to ecological problems. And so one thing I was interested in was the timber rattlesnake, and I'm interested in emerging diseases or diseases, generally speaking, that are infectious. And one thing I was interested in working with was snake fungal disease, and I had done some work with a professor, Dr. Danny Bryan, down in Cumberland University a couple of summers, and I had just this interest in studying the emergence or the transmission of snake fungal disease, and I also have an interest in physiology. And as an undergraduate, I did patch clamping and voltage gated ion channel research on crayfish leg nerves. And so my work kind of combines neuroendocrinology and disease ecology. So it's a kind of a combination physiological ecology, which the neuroendocrinology would fall under that category, and disease ecology of studying population-wide impacts of infectious disease. So basically, I study hormones and how that affects susceptibility to disease. So it's interesting. I had radio transmitter 21 timber rattlesnakes and for the study. So it's that's what I've been working on, and I also do some mentorship with an undergrad, and we're looking at similar stuff, stress stuff, and cottonmouths, and yeah.
Fantastic. Yeah. Well, just on a couple of points, I mean, from a biomedical standpoint for timber rattlesnakes, uh, they're a unique animal in that, and other snakes do this too, and we see this with most venomous snakes to some degree, but there's a large shift in venom from the northern populations down to the south, where where the Nords are what, for lack of a better term, an old adage is the hemotoxin, and then we get into neurotoxins when we get down south. Although from my work with snake venoms, whether it's been through the lab or been through unfortunate accidents, is that there's always components of both in these venoms. It's just which one is going to be the dominant in that, and we see more of a neurotoxin down in the southern states, traditionally what we call the trichodatus down there, and that's a whole other thing we can get into at some point. But so the rattlesnake is really, really cool in that respect. On the timber rattlesnakes, you're working with them out in the field, and the first thing that I discovered when I worked with them back in the day is I didn't know a lot about them when I first started, and this is in southern Indiana, and Dr. Minton had done some studies, and that's basically just where they are, in the state, but no one had really studied those. And when I got to working with them, I initially thought, well, yeah, the snake wakes up in the morning, goes out and does snake stuff, and like other snakes, what we traditionally thought. And man, it couldn't be any different. It's just an amazing animal in their biology and their habits and such. So why don't you let us know what you're finding there and with these guys, their whole biology aspect.
So, it's funny that you mentioned that, because, I tried to document patterns of behavior just, from a natural history standpoint, and kind of the things that they do. And like you said, it was very different than I had initially assumed that it would be. I noticed seasonal kind of phenological patterns. So, as soon as they emerge from hibernacula, they'll spend, I'm trying to think, when did I have this past season? I had one emerge. It was a late emergent snake, and it came out the first week of May. It was pretty unusual for here. They generally start coming out towards the end of March, and then they'll continue to come out through April. And then we had previously had tax day as the cutoff, that we thought if they're not emerging by tax day, then they're probably not coming out. And that was, like most things, was completely wrong. And that was based off of some information from a more southern population, which makes more sense that they should be out earlier there. Obviously, the latitude difference wasn't huge. But long story short, they tend to remain around hibernacula. It's kind of interesting. If leaves are not on trees, Franz de Waal, who's a primatologist at Emory, wrote a book called "Are We Smart Enough to Know How Smart Animals Are?" And it's amazing because they do have seem to have a sense about them, and I assume it's anti predation behavior that they'll leaf bed for about a month, which, as you know from radio tracking rattlesnakes in southern Indiana, when you have a timber rattlesnake that's already extremely cryptic, okay, with a transmitter in it, and they're undergoing leaf bedding behavior, where you may not see the animal at all, or the only thing that may be sticking out of the leaves are two little nostrils and two pits. You're really not sure what you're going to find when you get there. And then overall, once we move into the summer months, they'll spend a solid 2 months doing your classic textbook foraging behavior. And then once we go into the breeding season, here, we don't have a huge terrain gradient. and some of these animals of mine, especially the males, would just undergo just tremendous movements over land, and we're still kind of analyzing some of that data now. To tell you how much movement they underwent, with two of us trying to maintain 20 of them, okay, with radio transmitters and planted in the summer, and I didn't have the luxury of letting them out of range, okay. So they had to be available to me for data collection at all times. It wasn't one of those things where, well, they're gone now, but they'll come back, you know. I ended up actually, if I hadn't been a pilot and I hadn't been able to use the aircraft, okay, I would attach the antenna to the plane and take an undergrad with me, and we dropped GPS pins from the airplane, and this was a highly effective way, okay, to keep up with them. But the movement patterns were crazy over the summer, especially as we got into July and August. It was kind of nuts. And then they would go back into foraging mode in the fall. And interestingly enough, I had a large male 2 years ago. My daughter and I had kind of hiked up on top of this ridge, and the nighttime temperatures were dropping into the 20s, and it was 25 degrees. This was a week before Thanksgiving, and it was above freezing. We had hiked up to the ridge, and I had found a mound of leaves where I knew he was. I peeled the leaves back, and he was alive, and he had been outside with a temperature of 25. I went back the next day, and I thought he's probably going to be dead because it was another cold night. And the week before Thanksgiving, we found him on top of the ridge in 50-degree weather, and he had just killed and eaten a squirrel. So that kind of
Really?
yeah,
Wow.
yeah, it was kind of crazy. And so, and he was working it down and readjusting his jaws when we showed up, you know. So that was kind of crazy, and it kind of blew some of the conventional wisdom out of the water.
Right.
But it's amazing to see them. You know, they're a move and pause animal, you know, and it's amazing that they will sit in a foraging posture at the same tree for days on end,
Right.
seemingly motionless, you know. And so that's always a fascinating thing to see. And in my area, it's eastern gray squirrels that are consumed, but I've had them eating songbirds and other items. So
fantastic. Yeah, I back in the days, and I certainly didn't have transmitters in as many as you did. We only had a few snakes, and they were really tough to find. And
they're hard to find.
Yeah.
I was told by multiple people at the get-go that the 20 would never be possible.
Right.
And that did nothing but anger me. And so after that, I was on an absolute mission to prove every naysayer wrong. So, and I did. So
yeah, I found even with transmitters, I mean, a large majority of the time, I could get into that general area and still not find these animals. And, you know, that led me to an assumption back then that there's probably far more of these out there than we think.
Oh,
just because we're not seeing it. It's a perfect predator. They're very, very cryptic, like you said, with the leaf hiding, or just even out in the open. Sometimes you'll almost walk right by these animals, and they're very, very cool in that respect. But just their whole biology again. Now, getting back to hibernation with these guys, do you have communal dens in
we
Kentucky?
don't.
Right.
We don't. And so in fact, you know, if you're from the northeastern United States and you have timber rattlesnake populations up there, and you see those talus slopes and, you know, these kind of limestone effacements where they tend to go into these thermically stable cracks by the dozen, you would be completely, utterly appalled by the hibernaculum condition here. It's generally just an absolute random hole. Okay.
Right.
There's nothing remotely special about it. I have, it's enough that they're usually close enough to the surface that I can actually run an endoscopic camera in there and see them moving around in the winter, which I've done. I have a lot of, you know, I'll take the technicians out and we run the scope in, and you can see them in there. The conditions are not pretty when they come out. They're covered in mud. They look pretty bad. They're really, really dirty. No communal denning. But the interesting thing is, going back to the wide range on males, it's amazing because the overwhelming majority will come right back to that same random hole. They show an extremely high fidelity to that particular hole,
Right.
which blows my mind. It's how they find it. How do they find it again? It's and I'm sure it's a combination of some kind of chemosensory trails along with, but I would assume it also has to do with angle of the sun, and I have an interest in animal navigation. That's a whole other story, but I am fascinated by how they track back, to a 2.5-inch diameter hole.
Yeah, they are amazing in that respect, and many times they'll use the same tree to ambush from, or the same rock to, and it really is fascinating, especially when it's expansive as these forests that they live in, that their habitat is, that they do kind of follow this pattern. Which not only makes them a remarkable animal, but in a way, a lot of their behaviors and the whole physiology of the snake really puts them at risk as well. And, we refer to these as, like a K species.
K selected, definitely.
And that these animals are, they're built to do what they do out in the wild, and they do it very, very well. But we don't realize sometimes just how sensitive these animals are as individuals, or as the population as a whole. And, if you could kind of let us know, what are you finding as far as some of the greater conservation threats to these animals?
Okay, so I'm fortunate enough that I work in an area where we have large amounts of contiguous wilderness. Okay, so I'm not seeing a lot of human encroachment where the studies are conducted. Anywhere where there is a lot of human activity, you don't find them. Okay, so their historic range locally, they're extirpated out of absolutely everywhere where you're going to find large scale human activity, pretty well, period, with a couple of exceptions. And those are pretty much no man's land out in the middle of nowhere too, although people live there. Of course, we have the SFD situation. Okay. My opinions on SFD are, it seems to run a spectrum of, it's nothing, there's no problem here. We were seeing animals like that in the 60s and they're fine. There's a complete disregard for ophidiomycosis as a pathological entity by some people. And then at the opposite extreme, you have concerns over what I refer to as the sixth mass extinction of snakes as a result of fungal disease.
Right.
And I generally try to take a evidence-based approach and find myself in the middle of those two extremes where, my opinions are fairly tempered. Yes, it's a problem. It's a problem in some species in particular. And there may be ecologically nuanced or physiological reasons why that's the case. But I don't see huge populations. My opinion is that we're going to see massive population collapses, if we want to compare it to something like chytrid fungus and frogs in Central America. My opinion right now, that could change. If evidence comes in, I'll change my mind. But right now, I don't think we're going to see massive collapse of species. And I don't think we're going to see a massive collapse like we see with whiteness syndrome in bats. Okay. Right. But I do think that in some populations, this is a huge threat. Okay. And I say that relative to some populations. I have not seen a lot of mortality locally from snake fungal disease or something that I would
Right.
attribute to snake fungal disease. It's really hard unless you're doing a lot of internal histopathology type stuff, to make the declaration that the animal actually died from SFD as opposed to something else, right? In a wild snake that is facing the elements on a daily basis. But I do think, in other areas, I look at habitat destruction, and with rattlesnakes, especially the timber rattlesnake, habitat loss and direct persecution by people, is a huge issue in my opinion. And I think that snake fungal disease is an issue too, especially in areas of the Northeast. Okay. And I think there's reasons for that. I think the Northeast tends to get hammered. They've got a pretty short active season. We go back to communal denning. Everybody piles in on top of each other in the den. And, the immune system is probably downregulated during, hibernation.
Mm-hmm.
But habitat loss, direct persecution by people, and that is the direct persecution by people is something I do have to contend with, and that's one reason why I enjoy doing talks like this.
Right.
To try to change some public opinions about the timber rattlesnake. And one thing, I live in a rural area, and we have a lot of hunting. We got a lot of outdoorsmen here. It's no issue without, hunting and sportsmanship. But one thing that I'm actively trying to do right now is, even though, there's only so many hours in the day, and I'm not a big hunter, I just don't really have time. But one thing I'm trying to do is I'm trying to get more involved in local Ducks Unlimited, which is a way to access hunters that are out in the woods generally during other seasons as well, and Wild Turkey Federation stuff, where I can actually engage in a dialogue, and give presentations to people who are sportsmen and discuss, the biology of the timber rattlesnake, venomous snakes in general, that they're
Sure.
that they're beneficial, that we need them. And we can talk about that in a minute, but there was a study that came out of the University of Maryland that, showed that timber rattlesnakes probably interrupt the chain of transmission of, tick diseases to, by consuming rodents, where the rodent is the competent reservoir host for some of these pathogenic rickettsia bacteria. But direct where I am is direct persecution by humans, directly killing the animal. And I try to take an approach on this that if you don't know anything about them, right? And I'm a parent. I have two girls. If you live in a rural area and you have a large, and let's be honest, some of these snakes are huge. Okay, you've got a large rattlesnake that looks like a big venomous slug, they literally look, this, they look like they use the rectilinear motion. So they look like a giant slug crossing your yard. Yeah. And so if you have a big snake in your yard and and somebody goes out there and dispatches it, they're concerned about the welfare of their children playing in the yard. You're not going to get a lot of judgment. Right. From me. And in that respect, I try to find some common ground here and say that I do understand, but my goal is perhaps with better understanding, through educational approaches, some of the direct persecution can be reduced. Now, and that brings up issues with, relocating problem snakes, right? There's two schools of thought on that. And one is you can't do it, okay, because as soon as you move it outside of its home range, it will wander around and starve to death. I have no objections. I think we've shown that fairly conclusively, but we also have another kind of a school of thought that if you can translocate a snake to a new hibernacula at the time of ingress, you may be able to kind of graft that animal into that hibernacula. That's not something I'm a big advocate for from an SFD disease stand. You know what I'm saying? Introducing pathogens into a new hibernacula zone. So ideally the best thing to do, in terms of reducing direct persecution is education and educating people that the timber rattlesnake is not a real solid threat to public health. I mean, I think that you have a statistically, you have a higher probability of being killed by a vending machine, okay,
Sure.
than accidentally being killed by a timber rattlesnake.
Right.
So,
Yeah.
so I think the big ones are habitat loss and direct persecution by people. And I only say that from a disease standpoint, pending more data.
Mhm.
I'm more than willing to change my mind. Okay.
Sure.
If, and I don't even know if it's so much me changing my mind as me just awaiting,
Well,
incoming data.
yeah, we say that a lot, especially on this program, that, the only thing that really moves science is more science.
Right. Exactly.
And new stuff comes in, as and that's the beauty of science, is there's always questions and there's always answers out there to be found. Going back to the timber rattlesnakes and public perception of that, I too had a couple of different trains of thought on that. And people, in at least where I was working in Southern Indiana, people don't encounter them that much.
Right.
There were many times that I was working within a state park, and I would be down processing the rattlesnake. We, at first we were scale clipping and things like that. And I could look up on the ridge and see campers sitting in their lawn chairs, totally oblivious to what was going on
Sure.
down there.
Sure.
And the beauty of it is that they're on these ridges where people don't go. They don't hike on the ridge. They're down on the flat area or they're on top. So they're not really within that habitat. Now, one thing I have told people over and over, we work with rattlesnakes here in Texas, and we have a rattlesnake preservation trust that we do education with. And many times I would correct folks when they're telling the public, well, it's not a dangerous animal. It certainly is a dangerous animal. It's a venomous snake, and they're a very, very potent venom. Our timber rattlesnake is a very dangerous animal.
Absolutely.
And so once you start to tell somebody that it's not a danger, they know better, and you've totally lost them. You're never going to get anything else through to them because they know you're
right.
So now the difference is, once you can see the animal, it's really no longer a danger because you have the option to walk around or such. But I can certainly respect in the status of them in Indiana was you leave them alone, they were protected.
Right.
Although if you felt threatened or your family was threatened, you could legally dispatch of the animal. And that certainly happened from time to time. That's something that we as biologists sometimes have to accept. But again, I was a parent just like you, so it's like, I kind of get it. And
yeah, right.
I've been on the business end of a timber rattlesnake, and it's not a lot of fun. It's not a lot of fun.
But I can understand the psychological horror of you considering your child being bitten. I get
sure.
So.
Exactly, and they are, behavioral wise, when you see them, they're, to me, pretty placid animal.
Right.
But they do look menacing. You get a big timber rattlesnake coiled up, or like you said, doing the killer caterpillar thing across the ground. They definitely, they definitely looked at. But the issue is, and this comes back to kind of the whole biology of that animal, is that they're a very slow reproducing snake.
Sure.
So once you start to take one or two out of these little populations, you can really do a lot of damage.
Oh, absolutely. And you look at the gestation period. You look at the age at which a female becomes reproductive.
Mm-hmm.
And I think some of the population, I kind of liken it to Paleolithic humans. I mean, you think about it. I mean, obviously the litter size is bigger, but think about it. I think they've had cases of timber rattlesnakes being, amorous at age 30.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, but of course it depends on like that's another thing too, is going back to your initial comment about the range. These things vary depending on latitude.
Sure.
But I mean, it can take 11 to 13 years for a female, to become reproductive.
Right.
It's 11 years. And, you think about 11 to 13 years, it's not that far off of the same pattern that you would see in Paleolithic humans, where the life expectancy was about 35, right?
Right, right.
And it's the same, you now obviously you're not having Paleolithic humans dropping an average litter of kids of 7 to 12, but still,
Hopefully,
I
yeah.
mean, super select, and slow reproductive. Loss of one female. I mean, that's extremely costly.
It is. And, just for our viewers, you kind of went into the age at which they can become reproductive, which is
every 2 to 3 years, and some not at all.
right. So, yeah. So it's, going back to, that's what really makes it a sensitive species, especially when you've got, and it works fine for them when they're out there where they don't have human encroachment, and they're not, they have constant recruitment and such. But yeah, once the people start to move in and they're killing these, and I know I was talking to Marty Martin, I got to go out with him up in Maryland, and we looked at some of the northern den sites. I think we saw 34 snakes in just a couple of hours. It's tremendous. And but he was telling me about, we were on the mountain, and he was pointing down to some of the roads and how these roads are cutting off these snakes genetically.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
And
Llewellyn Clark did some work in Massachusetts on that as well.
Right.
And yeah, it can cut off, if you have a female on one side of the road, who has a fairly short home range, right? Mm-hmm. And the males are trying to cross that highway to get to her, and you have 100% mortality.
Right.
She lives in a genetic island.
Yes.
She's insularized on the other side of that road, and, she's cut off. And, so Marty saw the same thing most of that's West Virginia, I think, on high Appalachians.
Yes. Yeah. That's what it was.
Yeah.
And it's, and that's one thing that, to me is remarkable about this animal, is just that they're, just the way that they do. It takes such a long period to maturity, and then you're having young every, sporadically, or like you said, maybe not at all. And we compare that to some of the other snakes, especially when you get out here to Southwest. My biggest culture shock coming from Indiana, and we had 2 species of rattlesnake. We had Massasauga up north, timber rattlesnake down south, and both were endangered and protected. So when I moved to Texas and started talking to Texans, and they would talk about, killing rattlesnakes all the time. And of course, I'm like, why do you need to kill them? And until it finally occurred to me that, they're a very plentiful snake down here. Western diamond. Right. Your average rancher's got to kick 6 of them out of the way to get to his truck in the morning. So there's a lot of them out here. And my wife and I talk about this a lot when we travel through Texas. And we'll see some of these really, really, really remote areas where it's 45 minutes to the next town. And it's like, can you imagine living out here, 100 years ago and getting nailed by a rattlesnake? And, I could see where you would detest rattlesnakes, and you would probably kill everyone on sight.
Well, and that's another thing that you bring up, an interesting point, is that, the primatology aspect of this, right, too, is that, I think I'm sure you've spent plenty of time in Latin America. And have you ever seen a monkey encounter a snake?
Oh, yeah.
It's dramatic. And so, from the neurobiological standpoint, from the primatological standpoint, I'm a huge fan of Harry Green's talk on this, right? And I'm a little biased. My daughter is in the last slide looking at a copperhead, but if you look at that whole talk, it's amazing, right? And if you ever get a chance to read Isbell's book about how snakes and primates have the coevolution there may have kind of shaped the visual system of primates, and that you can put people in, I can't remember if they used, EEG or whether they were using functional MRI, but it was one of them, and you could flash a picture of a snake, that was faster than you could consciously register it, but your
Right.
brain saw it, right? And your amygdala goes crazy, and that we have kind of an inherent biological fear. At least some people do, and
Mhm.
perhaps even most, because if you look at ophidiophobia, I think it's the most prevalent phobia worldwide across
Right.
the human population. And I have a respect
Mhm. Sure.
for people's fear, and when people say they mean well, and they say, well, no one's born afraid of them, you have to be taught to be afraid of them. And I'm not convinced that that's true.
Sure.
I think neurological readouts from infants encountering pictures of snakes, I think that through the education process, right? And I'm reading a book right now. It's called Behave, and it's by a primatologist who's also a neuroscientist named Robert Sapolsky. It's a great book, but they talk about fear in humans, and the book's all about humans, the biology of humans at our best and our worst. They talk about the fear response and how it's initially ingrained in the amygdala, the older parts of the human nervous apparatus respond, almost automatically, right?
Mhm.
And in doing away with fear and doing away with phobia, that involves the activation of the prefrontal cortex, which makes us human, right? That we are kind of logically at that point suppressing amygdala function or amygdaloid function in the brain. And we're kind of thinking our way through this, right? And suppressing, kind of unlearning fear as, I think, more of an active process, right? And that's how I kind of think about the fear of snakes in that respect, is that while people tend to have a visceral reaction, and I'm going to be honest with you, I mean, there's some of us that are, I guess probably weirdos when it comes to being humans, that are like, heck yeah, we see a snake and, this is amazing. But, I don't know about you, but if even me, walking through the woods, if I happen to look down and see one at my feet,
Mhm.
there's some reaction in my, it gives you just a little bit of a jolt, and you
Sure.
go, oh, look at that, and so, I think that's why I think the education aspect is important, recognizing that people do have an inherent fear. And what if you were on a wagon train out west
Yeah.
and you probably know somebody who was bitten,
Yeah. Oh, yeah.
and the outcome may not have been good,
It
and
wouldn't have been
so,
good. Yeah.
and so I think it's, I think it is educating people away from fear, is an active cerebral process, right?
Right.
That's why I'm dedicated to that. So
Yeah. It's funny. It got me to thinking, two anecdotal stories to what you were talking about is when I was general curator out at Abilene Zoo, we had a troop of spider monkeys, and they would get going at times and just, I mean, creating a ruckus. And literally you would just get on the radio and go, can you go over there and find the snake?
right, exactly.
And
You know
because-
what it is.
Yeah,
I mean,
you knew they had that reaction to
Yeah.
a snake. And for myself, I've been working venomous snakes from, of all sorts for many, many years. But there are times back in my timber rattlesnake days, it was one day and I'd been out all day and it poured down rain. I was soaking wet and I'm coming up this ridge, and there is this monster timber rattlesnake. And I think I'd mentioned this one to you before, 59 and a half inches. And
yeah,
this
it's
thing
big. It's big.
was huge.
Yep.
And I'm just looking at it going, no, really? Because I'm by myself, I've got to process this snake. And it's like, really, I just want to go. And I didn't see anything and go the other way.
Yep.
Because, they, again, you could be comfortable with them and respect them, but you still know in the back of your mind that, yeah, this a dangerous animal could light me up and I may not walk out of here.
You and I both have a complete fascination, right?
Mhm.
Just an utter fascination. And and I think I probably speak for us both, right? It's a fascination with the biology of
Right.
the animal. But it doesn't stop the fact that, we're both bipedal primates that have brains that have been molded by,
Mhm.
millions of years of evolution by natural selection to potentially avoid something that is totally dangerous and detrimental to your ability to pass your genes on to your offspring, right?
Right.
And again, I notice it myself. Like if I even radio tracking, they, like I said, they're tough to find, right? And I wear bite-proof boots. Again, and full disclosure, I wear the bite-proof boots as much for the blackberry bushes and the ticks
Sure.
as
Oh, yeah.
the snakes, right? But nevertheless, if you end up, you're a little closer to the animal than you thought you were, and you look down and it's within 3.5 feet of your foot, fascination or not, it still gives you a little whoop.
Right.
And so, and then, I mean, for us, it quickly fades almost as fast, but there is this initial little, spritz of, neurological activity that happens
Sure.
right there, so I understand the fear. And I try to be really, really respectful. And, I tell people, I'm like, I'm not asking you not to be afraid, and I'm not asking you to like them.
Right.
What I am asking you to do is respect their rightful place,
Exactly. And
within
that's
the
important.
ecological puzzle.
Right. And that's what I tell people too. You don't have to, you don't have to love them. You don't have to take one out to lunch, but
Right.
respect, what they are and why they are. And I always encourage people too, is, I understand that. Read up a little bit on it. They're a fascinating animal.
Oh,
And,
absolutely.
there's a new book I just picked up, and I can't believe I hadn't picked it up before. Matter of fact, I got it on this shelf here.
I've read it. Yeah, it's great.
And it's
Yep.
great. And it really goes through with timber rattlesnakes, how we once really revered these snakes. Sure, we feared them and such, but they were iconic. They were, really a part of when we first settled this country. And of course, nobody had seen rattlesnakes before.
Sure.
Well, natives have, of course, but they were totally new to us. The Gadsden flag,
Sure.
Benjamin Franklin really pushed these animals and such. And so they really went from this really cool kind of a celebrated animal to almost this maligned animal.
Sure.
And I think we're starting to see kind of an upswing too. And over the last 20 years, I've noticed, there seem to be more reptile enthusiasts out there, or at least people who are more tolerant and interested in this. When I was a kid growing up, I thought I was all alone out there. I thought I was the only kid who liked snakes in the world, and now, you can't go throw a rock in a bush without a herp guy jumping out. And, because there's so many more, but as a society, I think we're starting to see an upswing, at least in some tolerance or willing to learn about these animals. And that's encouraging, especially here at a place like Texas where, we have the roundups and it's almost a cultural status thing to kill a snake and, any snake, but especially a rattlesnake. But, getting back to, and something you and I had talked about the other day, so I definitely wanted to touch on it, was I worked with a lot of different rattlesnakes in, here and in Mexico and such. But really timber rattlesnakes have to be up there near the top, if not at the top, of really one of the most inoffensive, placid rattlesnakes or snakes that I've seen out there. And I could think of all of the ones that I worked with in Indiana and radio tagged. And unfortunately, I haven't seen one in the wild since I left Indiana. I saw one roadkill here in Texas. And I really miss these guys. But
you're always welcome to come visit me.
Oh man, I'm going to. But out of all of these I saw, that I can only think of one that rattled, that really got defensive, and he was out in the sun, broad daylight, and I came up and I know when I put my foot down, I startled him, and as much as he startled me, but he rattled a little bit, but he certainly didn't do the big S loop like you see with some of our Southwest snakes. But other than that, he was fine. Now, even the one that did tag me was totally my fault. I had pinned him up against, I didn't even see him, and I pinned him up against a rock with my arm. What was he supposed to do? And, but, from talking to you, that's been kind of your experience as well.
It is. So, my situation's a little bit different. I did see a lot more rattling than you did.
Okay.
But this is only premised on one notion, right? And that is that I had to draw a blood sample.
Sure.
Okay. And they don't like that. All right.
No.
I don't blame them for not
I don't
liking
like that.
it.
Yeah.
Okay. I don't like it either. But there was, to tell you how placid they were, there were plenty of times where we would tube and I would do a blood draw and they wouldn't rattle at all throughout the entire thing. Okay.
Right.
Right. Now, there were plenty of times they did, but that was only after deliberately having to capture the animal, right? Dependent on, temperature outside, obviously. If they were cool,
Sure.
they wouldn't rattle at all. My experience is exactly the same in terms of it. Let's say, because I did, I wasn't drawing a blood sample every time I was out there. I was addicted to it. So I was out there all the time trying to keep track of them all. But my experience with the spontaneous rattling was exactly the same as yours. The only time it would happen would be when I happened to catch the animal on the crawl.
Mm-hmm. Right.
And I would be closer to it than I thought I was when I would, and all of a sudden there he is and he sees me and I see him and now he's mad. It was almost always males, right? And the females just kind of keep quiet. But by and large, I think Bruce Means down in Florida, someone who would like to be known just as much for his salamander work as his Eastern Diamondback work, but
Sure.
but he nevertheless is who we tend to think of when we think of Eastern Diamondback rattlesnakes is
Right.
Bruce Means. And I think he, in one of his nature documentaries, he referred to the Eastern Diamondback as the gentle Ben of rattlesnakes, right? And that's been pretty close to my experience with Eastern Diamondbacks as well. But I think the term gentle Ben of rattlesnakes absolutely applies.
Yeah.
Okay. To timber rattlesnakes. They are, and this is one of my just personal opinions, personal hypotheses on this subject is that, and I think they're completely nuts, but you've got the snake handling churches of Appalachia, and they do get envenomated. Okay. And a lot of times when they do get envenomated, it's catastrophic. I mean,
Sure.
if you're envenomated in the carotid artery,
Right.
somewhere where the snake, like you have a huge problem, or you're envenomated in the hand and you survive, but you're losing fingers. Okay. But to me, and this is something I've thought a lot about, one reason why I think, and this is an excuse to do it, but one reason why I think these people get away with it for as long as they do,
Mm-hmm.
when we plot that over the number of fatalities that you actually see, I think we've, in the state of Kentucky, I think we've had 6 fatalities from timber rattlesnakes, and every single one of them was in a snake handling church.
Yeah.
But I'm surprised it's only 6, right? And so, and I think one reason they're able to get away with this is because of the inherent placid nature.
Right.
Okay, you do not see them doing this with Mojave rattlesnakes.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly.
Okay, you don't see them doing it with prairie rattlesnakes that are rattling at you from 40 feet away.
Yeah, it is. It's totally different. And, when, to put it in perspective, I had one that I had a transmitter in, and this is the old days. And, and I'm sure transmitters are much better now than they were. But it was tough to find these, the signal would bounce off of the limestone and you would get out and you would find a general area, and then you had to find the animal. And so I knew in what area he was in. It was about the size of a bedroom. And I kept going around and around and around and around. And finally I kept going over this one log, and I turned around and I thought, you know what, I got to look. And I turned out, and there it was. And just sitting there. And I had stepped over him, 5 times, literally stepped right over him 5 times. And if he'd have been a Western Diamondback, or he'd have been a Mojave or something, probably just out of annoyance, would
Yeah,
have, you know, he certainly would have rattled by then. And this snake was just
Right.
sitting there. And,
Yeah.
you know,
I mean, I've had them, you know, fortunately, in all of my work and all of my I'm a very procedure. Well, I mean, I was a flew commercially, right? And, you know, I'm still a flight instructor on the side, and I'm really, really big on checklists and procedures, and, you know, this, that, and the other. And I don't like the feeling of adrenaline. You know, I would prefer not to have that, and in my policy was, you know, every day consisted of a safety briefing. And in fact, it was a safety briefing every time we encountered the snakes, right? And everything we did was just, I took a lot from my aviation career operationally to this, right? And it was just like a well-oiled machine, you know, and I'd tell them, I was like, I don't want my heart rate up 1 beat per minute.
right.
And we have done it right. If everyone is, you know, if there's no, I don't want drama. I don't want any
Right.
drama.
Exactly. Yeah.
You know, and so the one time out of the whole, you know, out of years, I had a female, and we would go back to how many more of them are out there that you don't know about. And, you know, she had moved under a log, and I was trying to take some data down, and my tech was standing right behind me. And the week before, I had found her locked up with a male that was like 150 yards away, and she had gone up under a log. And I was down there like with a flashlight, shining a flashlight up under the log, and the technician was like, you know, her boyfriend's coiled up right next to you. I looked over, and I went, oh, you know, you want to talk about a big neurological jolt. I don't think I recall being back on my feet again. You know, I think I self-levitated off the ground, and suddenly
Right.
standing up with no recollection of anything that happened in the, you know, he never moved. I mean, he never moved a muscle, you know. And so if people, you know, when people say, well, they're aggressive, you know, they're, if you've riled him up, you know, then, you know, that, yeah, but, you know, and even then it was most were fairly reluctant to strike, even when riled up. That was, there was individual differences on that. I mean, some of them, when they were riled up, they were psychotic, but you know, there was others where even riled up, you know, you couldn't get them to lash out, you know.
I've said that for, you know, about most animals, you know, but snakes in general, especially when we talk rattlesnakes and stuff, is, you know, they're not an aggressive animal, but they will defend themselves aggressively. You know, if they feel they've got no other choice, then yeah, you can get them, you can certainly get them riled up, and you definitely don't want to be on the business end of a timber rattlesnake. They're one of the more toxic snakes out there, really. And,
oh, absolutely. And that's just why I get highly aggravated, just like the rest of us do, when anytime, you know, social media, I see free handling.
Oh yeah.
You know, it makes me, you talk about a neurological response there, but that's a different one. That's anger, you know, that exactly. You don't want to be on the business end.
No.
And you don't want a $90,000 hospital bill or worse.
There's nothing bravado about it. And I've worked with, you know, over the course of my career, the biggest, baddest snakes in the world, and never once have I even felt the urge to free handle any of these animals. I'm comfortable around them. My heart rate doesn't go up, but I'm certainly not going to pick one up and tempt fate. I've been on the business end. The rattlesnake bite, timber rattlesnake bite I had in '93, that it was a bad bite, and I was probably a good hour and a half from my truck. I was by myself. I didn't even tend to go out that day. Sure. I was with, I had lunch with the late Sherman Minton that day. Okay. And we were in the area, and it's like, you know, I can't not go look around. So I went to a new spot, and this back in the days when everything had to be topographic map, you know, so you'd follow your topographic map. And I went to a ridge to look at potential hibernacula sites. And I climbed into a hole and inadvertently, make a long story short, pin went up against the wall.
Sure.
And what was he going to do? And, but I tell you what, it was a long walk back. I didn't think, I really didn't think I was going to make it. It
Right.
was a horrible bite, and it was a lot more neurological than I thought.
All right.
Than
Did
I
you get
had
the
expected.
metallic taste in your
Yeah,
mouth?
the whole metallic taste.
Yeah.
My vision started going in, and it was actually one of the scariest times I've had. And I've worked
Oh.
with animals of all types over the world, and it was it was pretty frightening. And
Yeah.
again, totally my fault with this animal, but it gives you a, a huge respect for that animal, what it's capable of, but also the way that they're capable of, that snake didn't rattle. That I had no idea that snake was even there until I pushed my arm up against it.
Right.
It's a very tolerant animal. And this was back in the days of the old Wyeth antivenom. This is before the Crofab and
Horses.
horse serum.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
43 vials of that. It was a nasty bite, and it took me, I had circulated all through my body. It took me a long time to hike back up the ridges of southern Indiana to get to it. But it definitely gave me a different respect for that animal, in that I know it's a rattlesnake. I know it's capable of doing things, but it's capable of some really nasty things, but it is so tolerant to use that. And
It's an extremely, yes, I agree 100%, totally tolerant. And I think from the standpoint of the free handlers, politically speaking, it doesn't do the animal any good. You know what I mean? In your case, it was a straight out accident.
yes,
Okay. You weren't, in other words, you weren't publicly inviting the problem.
right.
And so, accidents do happen, and that's horrifying, and you're an hour from the car, and, you could have died.
Sure. Yeah.
But at the end of the day, like you say, when you pinned it up against the rock, what was it going to do?
Exactly. Yeah.
It's such a different scenario there. That's a tragic accident. It's as opposed to showboating around on the internet, basically inviting trouble.
Right.
That was 43 vials of Wyeth antivenom, I mean.
Yeah. And I was fortunate enough to have Dr. Minton come to the hospital to advise on the bite.
Sure.
And I avoided, I could hear him talking out there, and they talk about, well, I think we can save his arm. And I go,
Oh,
that's when I'm like, wow, this is really serious. And,
yeah.
but he also advised against a fasciotomy.
Right.
Which was fantastic. And of course, for those who don't know, fasciotomy is when they basically fillet you to release the swelling, to kind of alleviate a compartmental syndrome. But it's not really needed in snakebite. I mean,
and that's another thing. I wonder how many fasciotomies, I'd be interested in seeing the data, how many fasciotomies have been performed in the United States in response to envenomation, where the person that the fasciotomy was conducted on did not have confirmed compartment syndrome.
Exactly. Yeah.
Okay. Because obviously compartment syndrome is a very serious deal. If the NBC reporter, Miles O'Brien, who was the science and aviation reporter that we all remember seeing on, he was on site in the Philippines for a shoot for NBC, and a box fell on his arm and crushed it, and he got compartment syndrome, had to have the arm amputated. Very serious problem. But
right.
When it comes to envenomations of the hand, and I'm not an MD, but I looked at, we had a case here locally several years ago, and I tell people, I'm like, if you live in a rural area, in the summer months, as the daytime temperature goes over 90 degrees Fahrenheit, stop walking around outside your house in the rural areas on your driveway after dark barefoot.
Yeah.
And here the risk is not admittedly from timber rattlesnakes causing a problem, but I would be fascinated to know if we were to go into the woods and suddenly extract every copperhead out there and measure how many metric tons of copperheads we had. It's by far the most common snake.
Sure.
And this unfortunate person was walking, on her driveway. I guess she was going out to the mailbox. It was after dark. copperhead probably had just fed, was using the hot asphalt, to help digest, and stretched out. She stepped on it. She was barefoot. It bit her. She was bitten in one foot. Okay. And freaked her out. So she started jumping up and down in place, and she started jumping up and down on top of the snake. And she ended up with bites on both feet. Okay.
Oh, no.
She was a mom. She said it was 1,000 times more painful than giving birth to her kids, as I recall. And then on top of this, she goes to the local hospital. They didn't know what to do with her. Okay. And so they sent her to a hospital 45 minutes away, who still didn't know what to do with her. And I think she ended up getting I won't say it was a free helicopter ride. It was a very expensive helicopter ride, as I recall, to Vanderbilt down in Nashville.
Right.
And where they actually monitored her coags overnight, gave her a bag of saline and some pain meds, and that was the extent of what they did. And I know, and she recovered fine,
Right.
but I know so many people, who went to the local hospital. I know people who have fasciotomy scars, up the tops of their hands,
Sure.
on the backside of their forearms, they're loaded with fasciotomy scars. And, it makes me wonder how many fasciotomies were performed in this country in the last 75 years
Right.
as a result of envenomation, where compartment syndrome was not confirmed.
Rattlesnake bite is certainly not to be underestimated, and it's a very dangerous thing. But even with my going back to my timber rattlesnake bite in southern Indiana, I was first taken to a hospital locally, and this is right kind of in the thick of their range, and they were like, "We have no idea what to do."
Yeah, it's scary.
Never dealt with it because it's so rare. And
Exactly.
I can't really think of anybody else. I know within the area, and I won't go into where it was, but within that area, I know there hasn't been another bite in that area in 25 years. And they're thick. I mean, not thick, but they're down there. And there's a lot more down there than people really think. But again, it's a very placid animal, and you really have to aggravate them and get them defensive. I always say they're not an aggressive animal, but they will defend themselves aggressively.
Absolutely.
And you definitely don't want to be on the business end of a timber rattlesnake. They're really high up there on one of the more dangerous rattlesnakes out there. But again,
I think their appearance doesn't do them any favors. And one thing that I always laugh about is if I'm showing people pictures of timber rattlesnakes that I've taken, and I show a headshot, there's almost a unanimous response, okay, from the general public, and that is he looks mean or he looks mad.
yeah.
And I'm like, that's the shape of their skull. They can't do anything about that, you're right. And but the menacing appearance, it just doesn't jive with the generalized nature of the animal, as long as it's being left alone. And come spring, everybody and their brother, my phone's constantly going off with snake identification. And
Sure.
there's been several of them where I don't even ID the snake, but they'll say, is this dangerous? And I have is this snake dangerous flow chart? Is this snake dangerous? Are you touching it?
Yeah.
No. Then no, it's not dangerous. Is the snake dangerous? Are you touching it? Yes, it might be dangerous.
Back at timber rattlesnakes, I mean, some of we can run through a little bit of the biology for the folks. Is naturally it's the males that get the big size.
Absolutely.
Now working down there, I know they get a little larger as we get down there. What are the average and the largest ones you're finding there?
Well, so it's interesting that you bring this up, and this is something that the males would tend to be anywhere from 45 to 55 inches, something like that. They're large, right?
Right.
And then the females, of course, were significantly smaller, and like 3.5, 4 feet max, right?
Right.
But I think everybody's like, well, when somebody kills one, they'll look at the rattle as like as age, and
Right.
not a reliable indicator. And it makes me wonder. Except I often wonder in terms of male size on some of these, because some of the large ones would have a really, really small rattle, but I could tell that it had not been knocked off.
Okay.
It had not broken it off. It was a pristine rattle, really short rattle. And then I would have some smaller males, right, that would have this tambourine,
Mhm.
and I wonder on age on those, is this resource limitation causing, what I'm saying? Is this snake relatively old compared to the other
Right.
one? The other one's huge, right?
Sure.
Where the, in the small one, 2 years prior, did we see a huge, did we see a huge mast failure and acorns in that area due to late season frost, or, that eliminated forage for squirrels? Did we see low
Right.
squirrel recruitment there? And so this snake is actually older than the big one, but substantially smaller,
Sure.
because they're not like us. And, for any of the viewers, they can grow indefinitely.
Mhm.
It'll taper off and slow, but they can get bigger their entire lives, right?
Right.
And so it makes me wonder on that one. So in terms of averages, it's tough to tell, because and I'm just basing that off rattle length, right? But like I said, some of them were massive snakes with tiny little rattle.
Right.
Some of them were smaller snakes with big string, and you're going, huh? Well, the large one hadn't lost it, because you can tell.
Mhm.
They didn't get it injured in a scuffle with something else. But yes, by and large, the males. I mean, there was a point where you could be like, well, you could just look and you knew, right, on the day that you captured it, what you were dealing with. It was a gigantic male, just because females just don't get that big.
Right.
And it was they, for females, whenever I would insert the transmitter, I would probe the animal to make sure that we had a confirmation on sex, right? Males, you almost never had to probe them, regardless of their size, because as soon as you put them under on anesthesia, there's something about the anesthesia that would cause them to evert their hemipenes
Right.
on the operating table. So you just knew, right? Because you could see. But yeah, by and large, and that's the sexual dimorphism there. If you look, there's a lot of people that seem to think that, for whatever reason, that the female timber rattlesnake is bigger than the male. And of course, that's based on the mating strategy of different species than the rattlesnake, which is, you will see heavy duty. This is something I have not seen in the wild. It's one of the few things I've not seen, but we've all seen the video clips, and you probably have seen it in Indiana. But is the male to male contest type mating.
Right.
There'll be a female within visual range, and then two males will combat each other.
Right. Doing that.
This can drive the differences in body size, right?
Right.
And so it's like humans, when we don't see huge amounts of dimorphism, but you also don't have human males beating each other up.
Sure.
For the females, right? So,
right.
But it's why you see, antlers in male deer, right? And so, kind of the same situation with body dimorphism in the biology of the rattlesnakes. So the male rattlesnake is huge, and same goes for the cottonmouth and the copperhead as well.
Let me ask you on. It's another interesting aspect I've always found with timber rattlesnakes is how kind of traditional they are. In their home range, and where they choose selective sites within that home range. Now I know for Indiana and some of the other places with the studies, your males are a lot more mobile than the females.
Big time.
And so what are you finding is the extent of the home range of the rattlesnakes there?
I'll have to get back with you on that, because we're currently analyzing that right now.
Okay.
Yeah. Stay tuned. So.
Wow, great.
Yeah. So we're going back through all of it right now and looking, and it varies from male to male.
Okay, good. Yeah,
You
it's
know,
they're fascinating animals in how they are. Again, I use the word traditional, and at least from what I found in some of their behaviors and such, uh, that we wouldn't really think of more of a, when you get out west here, and they have uh, a lot more places to hibernate. They've got a lot, of different things that these. It's always amazing to me with these snakes that they have all of this range, but they do many times kind of follow and stick to a pattern.
So most all of them, you could be, if I was to overlay GPS data points from the previous season, okay, based on dates, the amount of fidelity that you would see in where they were located geographically, they were insanely close.
Yeah.
Where they were the previous year. And I'm talking spatially, I'm talking within a matter of meters.
Sure. Yeah.
And like you said, they will set up ambush points sometimes at the same place.
Yeah, it's amazing to me.
Yeah.
It really, we think of these animals as, we don't, but people think of these as just a very basic, very primitive animal.
Right.
And I hear this about a lot of different animals, and it goes back to that animal's as smart as he needs to be.
Sure.
And he's been out there for, that variety, that species been out there for eons and eons and eons. So they're smart enough to have made it work for all of this time.
I don't think you're going to find them out there in the woods in the leaf litter doing calculus. I don't see them unifying the 4 fundamental forces of physics anytime soon. Having said this, I think that we have woefully underestimated their capabilities, and I think that probably applies to most non-human organisms. But yes, before I started this work, I mean, there's just no way to immerse yourself in the world of a Crotalus horridus until you've started doing tracking studies on them, and you realize there's a dimension to them that most of us as biologists have underestimated.
Right.
The general public has no clue about, and they do truly amazing things.
They do. And let me ask you this: I know I've got plenty of wonderful timber rattlesnake stories, but what have been some of the coolest things that you found? Some of the neatest things that you've seen with timber rattlesnakes out there?
Well, so I mean, anytime we'd find a mating event, that was cause for celebration. It's just not something you see, right?
Sure.
Generally, any encounters that were just post foraging, one thing I did notice that we documented that was, squirrels tend to use crepuscular, they're very crepuscular in their activity. And what we noticed that a time when ambushes really took place was within 30 minutes of sunset. We caught it happening, right? In the act, right? We caught them killing squirrels. That was always really interesting. But one of the neatest things was showing up at about 8:30 in the morning, and you knew the snake had just eaten within the last 2 hours, and it was really you can relate to that. Any time you see a big prey bolus, it kind of stirs your soul a little bit. But some of the craziest things that we saw that, and it's not that it hadn't been documented before, but in September, one year I was going to do a hormone sample, and as I approached the log where I knew he was, I noticed there was something a little unusual going on at the log. And then as I got up to it, within the last 10 minutes, I'd say, the snake that I was tracking had plunked a towhee, it's a songbird, right off the top of a log and was consuming it, which I photographically documented that. And, the question was, the big question was, did he scavenge the prey? No, he killed it right there. He was in total ambush. Textbook, Reinert and Kundal, 1982, timber rattlesnake will coil adjacent, to a log and have its head perched on the log, perpendicular to the long axis of the log, that the squirrels or rodents will use, as a run. And as they run down that log, it's got the chin there, detect the prey and plump. Well, apparently in this case, a towhee landed.
Uh-huh.
So, boom, took it. And what the real tip off was that there was a little spatter of blood on the ground, and this blood had not coagulated. Okay. So it was still, it had happened, and it happened just, a few minutes prior. That was really neat to see a rattlesnake that predominantly eats mammalian prey consume a songbird. Okay. And then one of the other things that I noticed was some arboreality. This happened more than once. I had a male that would go sit in a tree. This has been documented before, so this is not a novel behavior, but it's fascinating anytime you see it. And I had a female that she went and decided to sit 40 feet up in a scarlet oak and Quercus coccinea. It was interesting because she seemed to only go up in scarlet oaks. She went up in one day, and I got out there and she was way up there, and I got some pictures of that. And then she crossed a gravel road and went probably 100 yards to another scarlet oak. Probably coincidence, but there wasn't a ton of scarlet oaks out there. But interesting, she goes up in another scarlet oak, and this time she sat up on a branch for 2 weeks, 40 feet off the ground. So she wasn't sitting at eye level. She was 40 feet up there, and another graduate student was helping me track one day. And one thing you typically try not to do is you try not to track by yourself. If you snake by broken femurs, more risky to your health out here, And so I got another graduate student with me, and we approached the animal, and I looked at her, and she was looking good. She looked very kind of a velvety appearance, and I said, "Oh my goodness, okay." So she shed, and I said, let's walk back over to that scarlet oak, and we went over there, and sure enough, at 40 feet up in the scarlet oak, she had shed up there, which was kind of an interesting,
nice
phenomenon. And I've got some pictures of that we can throw up as well.
That'd be awesome. Yeah, the arboreality in the snake is something I think surprises a lot of people. And we certainly, here in the Southwest, we'll see the Atrox, the Western Diamondbacks, and they'll climb up in a bush.
Sure, eye level-ish, yeah,
and they're not all that high, but we've seen timbers, and it was funny because there was, I don't want to say there wasn't a lot of literature. I didn't have access to a lot of literature back when I was doing my work with timbers, and I had no idea to look up in trees for these animals.
Right.
But they can be on occasion very, very arboreal, and it's surprising, and it doesn't fit the mold sometimes of what you would think of a big, heavy-bodied snake.
No, it doesn't fit the first day we found her up in a tree, and my whole family was out there with me. And I'd always tell them, stay back 30 feet and let me find it. My situation with the transmitter is a little different than yours. I could pretty well pinpoint the animal down to an area that was a foot square.
Oh, wow. Great.
Yeah. I could go, if you were late hitting the attenuator, you could walk by it. You know what I'm saying? But generally speaking, I could home right to it. Right. And so I was out there in the woods, and I feel bad for my kids because they were standing back there. I think there's probably a cloud of profanity that's still hovering out in the air over there from where I was walking around in a circle, just could not figure out what was going on. I was at the point where I had like a stick, and I'm digging around in the leaves, I'm looking for a transmitter, and I'm like, this is, maybe this was predation, and there's like a, snake met up with the wrong red-tailed hawk out here, and there's a transmitter in the leaf litter somewhere, and I'm sitting down, and I couldn't figure it out. I couldn't find the transmitter. I couldn't do anything. And the receiver was still running, and I got really exasperated. And I remember I had kind of let out this sigh, right? And I took the transmitter and I propped the transmitter up on my shoulder, or I'm sorry, the antenna. I propped the antenna up on my shoulder. And as soon as I propped the antenna up on my shoulder, and it's facing behind me and up, and all of a sudden I got a massive signal. and
Right.
I turned around, and I stuck it up, and I looked down and I'm just getting, like 1.0 milliamps on the receiver, right? And and I look up there and way up there I could see her sitting up on a branch. It was bizarre, absolutely bizarre. Not where not where you typically look. I can tell you that.
Right, yeah.
I'm ready for that one. So
Yeah, it's an incredible, to me, and I go back to this, and I try not to pick favorites, but the Horridus are definitely my favorite. And but just the variety we see in these, not it just be, they have very traditional behaviors, but they never cease to surprise us with a lot
sure.
of things. Um, but even the variation in these, from the dark melanistic black coloration onto these bright vivid yellows,
Mhm.
and you get a mix in a lot of spaces. I would find these bright yellow ones, and then I would find these dark drab gray, and they weren't in ecdysis, they weren't getting ready to shed, but just such a variety of different pattern, well, not so much patterns, but coloration with these animals too.
Yeah,
And
same here. And I don't, we don't have the black ones here.
right,
But I would have any variation from yellow. Now all of them have the chevron and the big. There's not a single one of them that doesn't have the big rust mid dorsal stripe. Right, they've all
right,
um, and they're all chevroned. They're not blotched.
right,
Okay.
right.
But they could run the gamut from yellow, right, still, to brown, to gray, to almost a mottled type color, to silver,
Yeah.
extremely silver color, all the way to pink and purple. And I remember on a couple of them, I had a new field tech, and we had the snake in a tube, and she said, I had remarked to somebody else, and she said, "This snake is pink." And I said, "Yeah, he is pink." And I had one of the pink ones actually sitting in a tree, and I've got a picture of him in the tree. And he is pink.
Mhm.
So they are just, a really fascinating variety of colorations, and in some cases just straight out pattern changes.
Right. They definitely are. And, that brings us to another topic, which um, I don't get, and I don't know why it's controversial, but it's this whole, traditionally we thought of the timber rattlesnakes up here and these canebrake rattlesnakes up down here.
Right.
So we had Crotalus horridus and Crotalus horridus and trichodatus down here. The DNA work showed that no, it's
Right.
they're all one. And I think, and I haven't kept up with it, but I think, if anything, there might have been more of an east-west variation with these, but they're basically the same snake. They just, and we just discussed that they could be very, a wide variety of color
Morphological variation.
Yeah.
Yep.
And now we also see a shift in venoms when we get down there, but that's
Sure.
not really, we see that with Scutellatus Mojave rattlesnakes and Helleri over towards California and such. So there is a shift in venom, which is not, I guess, greatly surprising. But they're the same snake. And to this day, we will still get, well, that's a canebrake. It's a timber, it's a canebrake. And
Yeah.
And I just kind of like, doesn't matter.
It doesn't, and I agree with
southern
that.
variation.
I do agree with that in the sense that they're the same snake. I'm not someone who is absolutely crazy, generally speaking, about subspecies. And I say that I'm more than happy to accept subspecies if there is some valid science
Mhm.
supporting it. Okay, but at one point in history, it seemed like it was a subspecies for everything. And I agree with that that the best option there genetically is just simply Crotalus horridus across the entire range down to the northern part of Florida all the way up to
Right.
Vermont. and west into East Texas, but having said that, and I see the canebrake, there's, clearly we've all seen it down there in the very southern part of its range. Some of the morphological features of that animal
Sure.
are fairly distinct, and but if I ever use the term canebrake, it's I might say something of it's more of a canebrake-ish phenotype.
Right.
Yeah, what or something like that. But I don't. There's nothing. I don't. It's interesting. It's interesting who you talk to about it. There's if somebody's really really old school and they're desperately trying to latch on to the old days, and you'll see that it's a canebrake rattlesnake.
Sure.
It's a southern variation timber rattlesnake. Just like there is a.
One of the things we ran into, and this would have been back in the probably towards the late 90s. I did some work, provided some information for Dan Kyler.
Sure.
And there was a push.
Good guy, really good guy.
Oh yeah, he's a great guy. We love him to death. Yeah. There was a push to put these on the federal list. Right. And at that time, we still recognized the canebrake down here and the timber up here. Well, that would have made everybody in the middle kind of an intergrade. And the Endangered Species Act doesn't cover intergrades. And that's where we were running into that as well. When we get down like into your area and stuff, that they're going to be intergrades. And that was all based on colorations and such.
Yeah, the morphological, organisms look different depending on where they come from for various reasons, and, right. It's just like, you get certain populations of Carolina pygmy rattlesnakes are red. Right. They look like they're red as a brick, right? I've seen them in person. They're amazing to look at, and the idea is that, they evolved in a pine red maple conglomerate where you have, large amounts of anthocyanins in the leaves that are turning the leaves, and so, and who knows? Who knows, right? But
sure.
Technically, I guess it could be some kind of a point mutation, that it, but you would have thought natural selection would have weeded that out. Although, you can't, they are tough to see. I've been down there, right. But they just look different. But no one's claiming, you've got phenotypic differences. You go 2 or 3 counties over and they don't look like, and it's, but no one's claiming species status. That's okay. And that's okay.
No, one thing what I've always loved about, work in biology, work in the biological sciences and working with these animals. And I had kind of alluded to it before when we started working with some of the venoms in the NTRC lab, is the cool thing about this is you think you know something about this animal. You think you know everything there is to know. And then you see something or it does something that just explodes into 1,000 more questions. Yep. And so you're never bored. And there's always just something. And literally you lay awake at night going, I think I know. Yep. And it keeps you awake at night. And it's a fascinating world. And certainly. Well,
my de facto spouse, and she said it best. She said, she's an attorney, and she was talking about how when her day at the office is over, it's over, and she comes home and does something else. And she said, you all are the weirdest tribe of people she's ever encountered, because she said none of you retire, she said all of you will grow old, and you never retire. Even if you officially retire, you scale it back to like 40 hours a week, and then, she said, there's no separation of work and personal life at all. It's all the same thing. She's like, what you all do at work is the same thing you do in your free time when you're not getting paid.
Yeah.
And it's you speak the truth. If I'm sitting around in the living room, I'm probably most likely cogitating over, some question that's, and like I said, as soon as one gets answered, it opens up 10 more, and you're
Exactly.
down the rabbit hole you go, you know.
Oh, exactly. And, it's interesting that I had the luxury when I grew up in Indiana of meeting Dr. Sherman Minton, and
Sure.
and Dr. Scott Weinstein was kind of his student back then. And of course, he's out in Australia doing some work now. But what was interesting to me, and what you had just alluded to, is I took a drive with him down to southern Indiana to look. Well, we went to look at cottonmouths. There's a small population that was found in like Du Bois County in
Okay.
southern Indiana. And we got there and it was so hot and mosquitoes were, and he's, well, let's go back up to these ridges. So we got back up into kind of timber rattlesnake area, and we got out of the car, and I'm grabbing my equipment and I'm thinking, yeah, I'm going to have to move slow because, Dr. Minton's in his, he's in his 80s. I'm going to have to, go easy on the guy. And I looked up and he was gone.
Yeah.
And I didn't see him again for like an hour. And he came back and he had like 3 or 4 things. And I thought, man, this guy's running circles around me.
Well, it's the same thing you were talking about, how in the get-go, I think you said, back in the old days when a squirrel could go from Maine to Louisiana without ever touching the ground. The big story there was that, that the American chestnut tree had an acre of foliage, in its crown, huge, called them the redwoods of the East. Granted, before graduate school, I didn't know a lot about the American chestnut, but the idea was that the squirrel could go from Maine to Louisiana without touching anything but a chestnut itself. And so I get into grad school, and the guy that would end up becoming one of my very best friends studied the American chestnut tree. Okay. And they're still out there. And when our field work, I'll tell you that really quick, our field work ended, we ended up in the same place at the same time. And he was working on chestnut stuff, and I was doing the rattlesnake thing. And on the last day of field season, the tech's got a picture of he and I standing in front of a chestnut tree while I've got a timber rattlesnake in a tube.
Nice.
Which,
nice.
we had our respective study organisms, right there with us in this picture. It was really kind of a neat deal. But anyway, it was kind of the same thing. So some people came down here, biologists, and they were looking for chestnut trees, and he asked me if I would go out with them. And I said, sure. And we met at this hotel for lunch before we went out. I said, I don't know how much time I'm going to have in the afternoon. And all the other biologists showed up. They were all in like their 70s and their 80s. And I looked at him and I said, this isn't going to take very long. We're not going to be walking very far. And I was wrong.
Yeah. I hope to be that guy. I think this is a good place probably to jump off.
Yeah, no worries.
But I really do thank you for discussing this. And
thanks for having me.
Oh, I definitely want to have you back because
absolutely.
This is one of those, to me, one of those animals, we discussed it earlier. We could talk for a week and still not be bored and still not even get into the crust of it.
Sure.
But definitely, I wish you luck in your endeavors, and
thanks.
Look forward to what your research is turning up, and a way to really not just preserve this animal, but preserve the habitat around it. And again, it's such an iconic animal, and it's part of our heritage. It's part of our history. And, the more we can do with programs like this and really show people what this animal's all about and spur their imagination to look into them a little bit more and gain a little bit more appreciation. That's what it's all about. And
absolutely.
I think that's what drives us, not just that we have that insatiable drive to learn more, but to also share what we're learning.
Absolutely.
Because it's a fascinating world around us. And
absolutely.
The neat thing is when you're a biologist like this, and you appreciate everything, like from your oak trees and chestnut trees to your rattlesnakes and everything around it, you're never bored. You're never bored. There's an amazing world going on around you. And it's unfortunate that so many people go through life and don't see that. It's an amazing planet that we live on. And I definitely thank you for doing your part to help us understand that and help us preserve that. for future generations to come, because that's really what it's all about. So,
Well, thank you so much, Doug. I appreciate it. Happy to come back anytime.
okay, well, we'll see you soon. Thanks again. And, please keep us apprised of as work comes in, and we'll be looking forward to talking to you again soon.
Okay, fantastic, Doug. Always a pleasure.
All right. Thanks, sir.
Take care.
All righty.